G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope that you are super well. We're here today to talk about a brand new lens from Nikon, but firstly we are shooting on the Panasonic Lumix S5IIx with the latest firmware, and we're actually shooting with an external SSD recorder, which is super exciting. This is a certain way that you can do video by having external hard drives. It makes the workflow just that little bit quicker because you can work directly off these drives, just plug them straight in. But we will talk more about this new drive in a future video. In this video, I want to talk about the new release, the NIKKOR Z 35mm 1.4. Now, this lens seems to have excited a huge range of people, and it also seems to have confused a huge range of people. So I want to circle back to comments I made about 4 years ago in regards to the 1.8S lenses and why I thought they made perfect sense at the time. And now we have these 1.4 lenses which fit within the paradigm that they were creating back then. So let's get into why does the 35mm 1.4 non-S make sense with the ecosystem that's here today. So the first statement that I want to make is camera companies have an enormous vision. They have an enormous internal roadmap as to how they think they can best meet their customers' needs. And that's everybody. It's not just me or you. And how they can meet their financial obligations, which is, you know, to stay in business, to stay in profit. They're the two things that companies need to do. And obviously there's a mixture of both going on at any one time. Some decisions might seem to lean more towards let's stay in profit, let's keep the company alive. And at the end of the day, I think actually we should all embrace that. Companies do need to stay in profit. They do need to meet all of their obligations to their investors, their parent companies, and just simply stay in profit. Otherwise you don't stay in business. So that just needs to happen. And if profit is a dirty word for some people, I think it's worth considering that if companies are not in profit, they can disappear. And most really large companies don't actually run at very large profits. It might be anywhere between 5 and say 15%. And companies that do more than that, well, they are the outliers. So if you think about that, it's not a really massive margin. And then when we're considering that companies also, well, they're trying to grow, they're trying to expand what they do, then some of that money might be plowed back into that. So and you also need rainy day money for when things go wrong. Let's say a 10% margin, which I think is what Nikon is hoping for, somewhere in that realm. It's really not a huge margin to keep things rolling. And we have to keep in mind that the camera industry has changed immensely in the last decade. From the huge numbers of cameras that were sold to where we are today, and the industry is trying to stabilize. It's trying to understand if this is where the industry is up to. Now, I know this is a long preamble about the 35mm 1.4, but I think it's super essential for understanding that the decision about one particular lens is not made in isolation. It's made about the entire ecosystem, and it's made for all customers, as I said at the start. This does dovetail just very slightly into a comment that the CEO of Sigma made, which I will talk about in another video at length, but I'll just touch on here. And that is that his concern is that the camera market may not yet have stabilized at this point. Now, I think we're looking at around 5 to 6 million cameras being sold each year across all brands, and the industry's hope is that is where it's going to stabilize. Yet the CEO of Sigma, he has his concerns that we are still seeing the influx of DSLR users. And once that comes to an end, then that is where we will find the flattening of the market. And we might not be there yet. So this is a really interesting statement. And this is where I circle back to companies need to make profits in order to be able to survive these fluctuations, these massive fluctuations. I don't think we realize that if suddenly there's 10% less sales, if the market goes from 5 million units to 4.5 million units, that's a 10% decrease. And if that's spread across every company, and every company only has a 10% margin, then what that means is you're starting to get very close to break even. You do have to have wriggle room. Now, of course, the numbers aren't exactly like that, but in general speaking terms, you're obviously going to spend less if you sell less. There needs to be contingency for changes in the market, for growth, research and development, which I know is all built into the budgets, the annual budgets, but there's also major events like earthquakes, which we've seen devastate multiple Japanese manufacturers, including Nikon. For me, profit absolutely has to happen, and we have to have a range of products that meet different needs in the market. You know, the entry, the mid, and the top. Listening to Rishi's video, and he stated that the lens that is released is not the lens that's on the roadmap. That's what he said. Okay, what that means to me, what that says to me is the lens that's on the roadmap is not here yet, so this doesn't replace it. Presumably it's still coming if Nikon is following through on the roadmap. So let us continue to assume that a 35mm 1.2 is still coming. So we're going to have a premium 1.2, a premium 1.8 and a 1.4. That's where we're up to. Now, my first statement about this is if Nikon had made a premium 1.4, an absolutely stellar 1.4 S class lens, what that does, and we're profit making, remember, what that does is that makes the 35 1.2 S lens less compelling. It would absolutely mean that less people would purchase it. Also, in all real sense, if I was confronted with a 35 1.4 S, which would be a stellar lens because Nikon they just keep refining everything, and lenses each year are just getting better and better. So many people would just settle on the 35 1.4 S, and I do really think it would diminish the sales for the 35 1.2 S. So that's the first reason. And I think that makes perfect sense. There's just enough separation between a 1.8 and a 1.2 to make it make sense. But between a 1.4 and a 1.2, you really would sell so few lenses. I really want to emphasize that point. It just makes no sense. Now, what I said 4 years ago was that the 1.8S lenses, of which at that point in time we had a full suite of them, had replaced the 1.4s. And not only had they replaced them, but they were cheaper and far better image quality across the board, the ones that we have today. No question. So for example, the 85mm, I've got the 85mm f-mount 1.4, I've got the 85mm 1.8S. The 1.8S is a far better lens than the 85 1.4. Yet, I paid less money for the new Z1, and you're only getting that 2/3 of a stop difference between 1.8 and 1.4. So from a light gathering perspective and depth of field perspective, it's absolutely minor. A really super high quality lens, more affordable than the previous generation, with a very slight difference in f-stop and depth of field. And I think it was a win, because what it allowed is for lots of people, including me, to buy the whole suite of 1.8S primes without it being a super expensive exercise. Really smart. And then straight away, we saw the 50 1.2 arrive, and then the 85 1.2 arriving about 18 months ago. We could clearly see a stellar difference between these lenses. Nikon, essentially with the 1.2, is saying, we are not compromising anything. We are just throwing the absolute kitchen sink at this optically. Size and weight, we're doing our best, but quite frankly, if you want near on optical perfection, then these are those lenses. And they are the premium, they are the Rolls-Royce, they are the Ferrari, they are the Porsche 911. Go for it if you want to go for it. But in the 1.8s, you get the Subaru WRX. It's still crazy fast, it still handles like a maniac, but it's not $200,000, it's $50,000. Talking Australian money here. A 1.4 S line in the middle of a range of growing 1.2s and a range of 1.8s kind of makes no sense and is not necessary. For example, for me, who owns the 50mm 1.8 and the 50mm 1.2, I might consider it if it's this 1.4 non-S, but I definitely would not consider it if it's a 1.4S, because I already have two extraordinary S lenses at 1.8 and 1.2. So there's this juggling act of working for a customer like me. There's a juggling act of working for customers who maybe don't have any of these lenses. And there's also a juggling act of working for new customers or customers moving from DSLR to mirrorless. With a Stellar 1.8 and a Stellar 1.2 S lenses, you just don't need a 1.4. It doesn't make sense, and it isn't creating segmentation. It's just all the same with almost no difference between them. They kind of had no other place to go. What I love about the 1.4 non-S, personally, and I said this in my original first impressions video, is that this allows almost any user to get into the system at a pretty affordable price. Now, I want to talk about price. The world does keep changing, and there's just literally nothing that we can do about it. Certainly over the last decade, the cohort has shrunk immensely, immensely. Now, when people look at the cost of lenses, what they're doing is they're looking at previous F-mount lenses. Now, F-mount lenses and lenses that came out in the last 20 years, you know, the chunk of 20 years before F-mount stopped being made, the pricing in those lenses were created in a time where there was much higher volumes. Now, what higher volumes allows for is reductions in pricing. It's as simple as that. More volume, you can potentially make it for less. Less volume does cost more to manufacture. Not only does it cost more because you're making less, but the quality of these lenses is higher. With a lot of products, there's an early adopters tax. If you want to buy a product in the first 3, 6, or 12 months of it existing, you are going to pay more than anybody else. And if you wait for the first round of Boxing Day sales, then it is going to be cheaper. Is it going to be 5, 10, 20% cheaper? Yes, but you will always pay a premium on launch. So I find it a little bit difficult and quite confusing when people compare prices with new versus really old secondhand. It literally makes no sense. All you're doing is comparing a price, but you are not comparing apples with apples. If you are interested in new technology, then that's the price you pay. If you want to buy old lenses, then buy old lenses. But otherwise, you can't compare them. They're completely different. And they're new. I will just reiterate, anything that's new, you will probably almost guaranteed be able to get it for 10% less in a sale within 3 to 6 to 12 months of any product being launched. And that's just the way it is. To hear people complaining about the price of new technology, it just simply makes no sense to me. The new 35mm 1.4 is $599 US. It might be $499 US by Christmas. And just because you can't buy it launch day, that's just the way of the world. The final thing I want to say about price is inflation. There would be a significant amount of inflation between a 35mm lens that was, say, produced in 2007 or 2012. I don't know the dates of the F-mount lenses versus today. But let's say inflation's running at 5%. So what that means is $100 becomes $105 in 1 year, and then another 5% on that is like $111, and so on. What that means is inflation might double the cost of a product, let's say over 10 to 20 years. And by rights, it should be double. When I see people comparing against objects that might be 10 to 20 years old, and they're going, oh, it's, you know, $200 more or whatever across, say, $600 or $800, it's like that's not even keeping pace with inflation. 1, the technology is far superior. 2, and there's a much smaller market, so economies of scale are not there. 3, when you take all of that into account, it's amazing. These things are actually, in real terms, getting cheaper. That's the reality of it. So that's pricing, and that's the ecosystem. This lens, the 35 1.4, we could not have had a 35 1.4S with all of the S's potentially either side of it. It does sound to me like the 35 1.2 is still on the roadmap. It's still coming. Like I said, based on what Richie said, that this is not the lens on the roadmap. Still on the roadmap, potentially still coming. If I was in Nikon's shoes, I would be making these 3 lines of lenses. So I'd be making the 1.8 line, which they have, the 1.4 line. Well, we've got 1, and the 1.2 lines, which we've got 2 and a third one on a roadmap. Of course you would, because there's people that are going to buy all of these. I love the 1.4 because they're for everybody. You get 1.4 of light gathering, and you get the potentiality of what 1.4 gives when it comes to depth of field. These are things that a lot of photographers love. We far prefer shooting at, 1.4 or 1.8 than f/22, the majority of us. And let's not forget, at f/22, diffraction is a problem for cameras at 45 megapixels. And it might even be a problem at 24. I haven't looked into that, but it's certainly for 45, 50, and 60, at f/22, diffraction is absolutely an issue. It is their most affordable price at a 35 1.4. I think it's fantastic when you take into account the update in technology, inflation, and the fact that the market is considerably smaller than it was 10 years ago. This is advancement, and it's still absolutely a fantastic lens that if you're a hobbyist, an enthusiast, a portrait photographer, a journalist, you're traveling, you're a food photographer, you're a content creator, there are so many use cases for this lens. And as people said to me in my comments, fantastic for video as well. Like, this is super light, small and bright, would go fantastically. Here we are on the Z6 III. So exciting to be able to talk about the Z6 III in the open and not have to worry about anybody hearing me. It's just a great combination for that use case. And for those that are worried about the 1.4 versus the 1.8, and if you don't have either yet, the 1.8 is stellar, and that difference in f-stops is negligible. And then when you add, if you're worried about the light side of it, when you add in-body image stabilization, that'll save you on the light side of it. We've also got high ISOs, and we've got AI noise reduction. There's just really no issue in this day and age for the difference between 1.4 and 1.8. No one should be worried about it. You shouldn't be worried about it. And if you want a 1.4 premium lens, right? Well, what Nikon is doing today is they're creating 1.2s. We have an 85, we have a 50, we have a 35 on a roadmap. You make your choice. There's still premium lenses, the absolute Rolls Royce. They still exist, but it's now a 1.2. And I can tell you, the 50mm 1.2, 85mm 1.2, these are my go-to lenses. I love them. They are the most extraordinary pieces of glass, and of course Nikon gave us the 135 1.8, which is beyond those. Yes, it's a 1.8. That's because it would just physically be too large to make it a 1.2 or a 1.4. But at 1.8, it's optically stellar. And something that all of these primes do, the 1.8s, the single 1.4, and the current 1.2s, something they all do, you can use them all at their maximum aperture, which is not something that we can say for previous F-mount glass. We just simply can't. And that alone is such a fundamental shift between the past and today, that alone is worth the entry price to any of these lenses from my perspective. So just think about it. We used to have to buy lenses, they were 1.4s, but really we needed to use them at f2 or 2.2 or 2.8 to get them to be at their best. And this is not the case anymore. So we're just not comparing apples with apples, and I would like to see more apples with apples comparisons and more apples with apples thought processes and use cases thought about. And I'd love to see this lens in more people's hands so they really understand that it's a great little performer, even so it doesn't have the S in front of it. But to repeat one last time, a 1.2, a 1.4 and a 1.8S does not make any sense to me. There needs to be some differentiation just to make the 1.2 lenses make sense, and so they sell a few. All right, everybody, well, thanks for joining me. I just kind of wanted to talk about use case and the business side, and to me, the logic behind this lens. And to me, it makes absolutely perfect sense. And this is genuinely my opinion as a small business operator and someone who's been a photographer for 35 years, understanding deeply what's going on with mirrorless cameras and the Z mount system, and has been very closely watching and monitoring Z and Z lenses since day one. All right, everybody, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep it beautiful down there. Let's keep it beautiful. I think that's the only way to fly. Otherwise it gets boring if it's not beautiful. But I love to hear your thoughts, and it's been so good to see you. And if this is your first time here, I would love to see you again. So please do subscribe. please share and please like. All right, bye for now.